Welcome, weary traveller. Tonight, we take a slow and quiet journey through the forgotten corners of history, not to celebrate heroes or victories, but to gently explore the lives of those who endured the worst jobs the past had to offer. In this softly spoken journey, we will meet those who lived lives of quiet suffering. The plague doctor masked in beaked leather, the Viking thrall toiling for a master, the streetwalker in soot-covered London, and the gong farmer labouring waist-deep in filth. Their stories are grim, but tonight they will be told slowly, gently, like echoes carried on an evening breeze. This is history not to shock, but to soothe, not to frighten, but to fade softly into dreams. You may hear of cannon smoke and saltwater as a young powder monkey loads charges below deck, or the silence of a galley slave chained to an oar. These tales were once real. Now they are soft ripples on the surface of time. So take a moment to get comfortable. Nestle into your pillow. Feel the blanket wrap around you. If you enjoy slow histories and quiet voices, consider liking this video or subscribing, but there is no urgency, only stillness. Close your eyes if you wish. Let your breath fall gently in and out like waves against forgotten shores. Tonight, we are only visitors, moving gently through the lives others once lived. And now, let us begin. The Black Death swept through cities and countrysides with devastating speed. No one, peasant or noble, felt safe. People who seemed healthy one day could be dead by morning. The psychological impact penetrated all levels of society. Terror and panic reigned. The dead and dying were often left in the streets, abandoned by even their friends and family, in fear. Many once thriving settlements became ghost towns as those who could flee did so, and everyday life ground to a halt. Amid this nightmare, the plague doctor emerged, a figure of both hope and dread. City authorities, desperate for help, hired special physicians to treat plague victims when no one else would. Even the Pope in Avignon brought in extra plague doctors to tend the sick. These doctors were tasked with treating everyone, rich or poor, often in exchange for a fixed salary. But their reputation was mixed. Some citizens saw the very presence of a plague doctor as a dire warning that death was near. Indeed, the appearance of a masked, cloaked doctor on a street often sent shivers down spines, a sign that the plague was in their midst. Regular physicians were overwhelmed, and many perished themselves or fled. For example, of 18 doctors in Venice at the start of the Black Death, only one was still on the job by 1348. 5 had died of plague, and 12 had gone missing or fled. In this climate of despair, the plague doctor stood as a last, macabre sentinel between the living and the dead. To confront the plague, doctors donned a distinctive array of protective gear, notably the iconic beaked mask filled with herbs like lavender and mint. They believed these aromas protected them from disease-causing evil vapors, or miasma, though this was rooted in flawed science. They also wore wide-brimmed leather hats, waxed coats or gowns, gloves and boots to cover every inch of skin. Carrying a wooden cane, they examined patients from a distance, using it to point out symptoms or maintain separation. Their appearance was intentionally imposing, lending authority and instilling fear. For many victims, the haunting bird-faced figure was the final sight before death. From dawn to dusk, the life of a plague doctor was a journey through misery. Each morning, the doctor would suit up in his protective costume, ensuring the beak mask was securely fastened and stuffed with fresh herbs. Steeling himself, he would venture into plague-stricken neighborhoods, often whole districts under quarantine. House by house, he made his rounds. At the door of a home marked with a red cross, a sign of infection, the plague doctor would knock or ring a bell to announce his arrival. Inside, he was greeted by scenes of horror. Patients writhing in pain with fever and blackened swellings, or corpses sprawled where they died. Holding his breath behind the mask, the doctor approached the victims. Using his wooden cane, he might point to a bubo on a patient's body, or to gently prod the patient's limb to test for signs of life. When treating the sick, the doctor applied whatever remedies he could. Perhaps he lanced a bubo with a quick incision to release the foul pus, then pressed a garlic poultice onto it. He might place leeches on the patient's skin to draw blood, or administer a draught of a herbal plague water to induce sweating. In some cases, the doctor simply offered comfort, giving the patient a few drops of theriac, a medieval herbal concoction, or saying prayers over them, knowing there was little else to be done. Throughout the day, the plague doctor was also an observer and a record keeper. He would note down the number of infected and dead in each household. One of his official duties was to maintain public plague records. If a patient died while he was present, he might certify the death and later report it to the town authorities. In certain cities, plague doctors were even asked to perform autopsies on plague victims, cutting open bodies, an unusual practice at the time, to examine the organs and understand how the disease killed. It was a grim task, but one that hinted at early attempts to investigate the illness scientifically. Plague doctors also often functioned as crude public notaries. They would collect last wills and testaments from the dying, or relay final messages. Since no priest or lawyer would come near, the plague doctor was the only witness available for a person's last wishes. They sometimes gave out advice to the healthy on how to avoid illness, such as burning tar or carrying flowers to ward off bad air, and warned townspeople to avoid contact with the sick. Each encounter was brief, done as quickly as possible before the doctor moved on to the next house on his list. The risks and challenges of this routine were enormous. With every patient visit, the plague doctor was exposing himself to the very contagion that was killing everyone else. The thick waxed cloak and mask provided some protection, but the doctor knew it was far from foolproof. Fleas, the true carriers of plague, though unknown at the time, could still jump and bite. A cough from a patient could send deadly droplets past the primitive mask. The longer a doctor worked, the more likely he would contract the infection himself. Many plague doctors paid the ultimate price for their service. Historical records tell us that plague doctors often did not survive long. To mitigate the risk of spreading the disease, a plague doctor usually lived in isolation away from healthy people. After finishing his rounds for the day, he could not simply go home to his family, if he even had one nearby. By agreement, he was required to quarantine himself for a lengthy period, often lodging in a segregated house or a makeshift hut provided by the town. This meant that plague doctors led a lonely existence even outside of work, eating and sleeping apart from others, constantly monitoring themselves for any hint of fever or the dreaded swellings. Being a plague doctor was not only physically perilous, it was psychologically harrowing. These men, and in rare cases women, were surrounded by death at all times. The sights, sounds, and smells of the plague were inescapable. Anguished cries of pain, the reek of decaying bodies and smoke of constant bonfires meant to purify the air, the eerily empty streets echoing with the refrain, "Bring out your dead." Day after day of this macabre reality took a heavy toll on even the hardiest soul. Many plague doctors lived in a state of dread of catching the disease, and perhaps an even deeper dread born of witnessing human suffering on an unimaginable scale. They coped as best as they could. Some turned to religion, praying fervently for endurance or seeing their work as a sacred duty. Others likely became numb or detached as a survival mechanism, hiding behind the impassive mask. Personal writings from that era hint at their mental state. The French physician Guy de Chauliac, who served during the Black Death in Avignon, confessed that he persisted in his duties with constant fear for his own life. Yet he did not dare to flee because he felt it was his obligation to stay. This mixture of courage and terror was the plague doctor's daily companion. The plague doctor also faced social stigma and isolation beyond the quarantine of his contract. To the common people, these doctors were eerie figures. Their strange costume and role made them objects of suspicion. In some accounts, townsfolk would refuse to let a doctor lodge in their area, or would only leave supplies for him at a distance. The doctors were feared by the very communities they served. After all, seeing a beaked mask appear in one's doorway was a sign that the plague was at your doorstep. For the townsfolk, it was as if the grim reaper himself had come. Moreover, not all plague doctors were compassionate healers. Some were opportunists or charlatans, which further tarnished their image. There were whispers that certain plague doctors did nothing but count the dead and collect fees, or that they sold fake cures to desperate families. This led to mistrust. They occupied a strange social position, both needed and scorned. People were grateful someone was willing to tend to the sick, yet they also regarded the doctor with fear and sometimes resentment, especially if treatments failed or if the doctor charged extra money. The result was a lonely existence. Even after an epidemic passed, a plague doctor might find himself shunned. Few wanted to associate with someone who had been so close to the plague. In some cases, plague doctors had to move to new towns to find acceptance or work again. Despite all this, many plague doctors persevered, whether out of duty, faith, the promise of a good salary, or a genuine desire to help. They continued to confront fear and death daily. In the 15th to 18th centuries, a wave of paranoia swept through Europe as thousands were accused of witchcraft amid rampant fear and religious fervor. From Germany and France to Scotland and Switzerland, witch hunts led to roughly 50,000 to 100,000 executions over 350 years. Torture was routinely employed to elicit confessions, and a guilty verdict meant a death sentence by some of the most brutal methods imaginable. One early ordeal for suspected witches was the search for the devil's mark. It was believed that witches bore a hidden mark or extra nipple where their demonic familiars suckled. Interrogators would strip the accused and shave their body to expose any blemish or mole. Professional witch prickers were then paid to jab needles and pins into the suspect's flesh, sometimes all over their body, until they found a spot that did not bleed or feel pain. Supposedly the witch's mark where the devil had sealed his pact. In their zeal, some fraudster prickers even used trick blades that retracted into the handle, creating the illusion of piercing flesh without drawing blood. This gruesome poking and prodding was agonizing and humiliating. Victims, often terrified and exhausted, would be stabbed dozens of times, desperate to prove their innocence in a test rigged against them. It was a cruel catch. 22. If they screamed in pain and bled, they were merely human, but likely still suspected. If they didn't, they were deemed witches marked by Satan. Such evidence of guilt would then be used to justify further torture or execution. One of the most common tortures in European witch trials was the strappado, a method explicitly recommended in the infamous 1486 witch hunter's manual Malleus Maleficarum. In this ordeal, the victim's hands were tied behind their back and attached to a rope. The executioners would then hoist the accused into the air by this rope, pulling the arms painfully backward. With a sudden release, the prisoner would drop, often stopping short before hitting the ground, causing their own body weight to violently yank the arms and shoulders. This often resulted in dislocated shoulders and tearing pain. According to the Malleus Maleficarum, jailers were instructed to prepare their implements and, if a prisoner would not confess, to make the prisoner fast to the strappado or some other implement of torture. The victim could be raised and dropped repeatedly, increasing the agony each time. Under such excruciating pain, many broke down. Interrogators would pause to demand confessions, then continue the torment if answers were unsatisfactory. The strappado left no external blood or wounds, but the internal damage, torn ligaments, stretched sockets, was severe. It exemplified the era's brutal logic. Extreme pain was not only justified, but necessary to combat what was seen as an ultimate evil. Not all torture devices were large. Some were handheld instruments of terror. Thumbscrews, also known as pillywinks, were a commonly used torment, especially in Scotland and Germany. This device was essentially a vice for human digits. The accused witch's thumb, or sometimes all the fingers, would be placed into a small metal press between two flat boards. With each turn of the screw, the boards would clamp tighter, painfully crushing the thumb bit by bit. Interrogators could tighten it gradually, increasing pressure until bones splintered. In Edinburgh's Tolbooth prison, for example, thumb screws were very commonly used on accused witches. The pain was disproportionate to the size of the device. Victims described feeling fiery agony as their fingernails cracked and knuckles were ground to pulp. Scottish records from the North Berwick witch trials recount how a healer named Gillis Duncan had the pillywinks put on her fingers until she named accomplices. Likewise, another accused, John Fian, a schoolmaster, was subjected to torture by thumbscrews as well as the boot during his examination. In the cramped confines of a cell, the sight of these simple iron screws struck terror. They allowed torturers to inflict controlled, focused pain, all while calmly urging the prisoner to confess. By the time the screws were loosened, a suspect's hands might be left mangled, and their resolve utterly shattered. Even the process of determining guilt could itself be deadly. One infamous trial by ordeal was the swimming test, used in many European locales, especially in the 17th century, to prove a witch's guilt or innocence. In this bizarre and barbaric practice, the accused would be brought to a pond or river, stripped to their undergarments, bound, and then tossed into the water. Because witches were believed to have rejected the sacrament of baptism, it was thought that water would reject them, meaning a witch would float, unable to sink, as the pure water cast out their evil. Conversely, an innocent person, free of sin, was expected to sink like a stone. Of course, this meant that floating sealed your fate. You would be condemned as a witch, whereas sinking could mean drowning. Typically, a rope was tied around the victim's waist so they could be pulled up after sinking, in theory, to prevent death. In practice, panic and chaos often ensued, and accidental drownings were not uncommon. Many women and men subjected to the swimming test flailed in terror as crowds watched from the banks. If their bodies bobbed to the surface, onlookers took it as proof of sorcery. One 18th century account from Hungary describes a woman who floated during the test. She was promptly pulled out, beaten, and later burned at the stake as a witch. The ordeal by water was thus a no-win situation. A suspected witch who sank might die, but one who survived the water would face execution. This so-called test was really just another form of punishment, an early torment in the witch-hunting process that played on primal fears of drowning. It exemplified the cruel superstition over reason that defined the witch craze. The ultimate fate for those convicted of witchcraft in Europe was often to be burned alive at the stake. Death by fire was the traditional punishment for heresy, and witchcraft was deemed a heresy against God. While England generally chose to hang condemned witches as common felons, in most of continental Europe, including Germany, France, Switzerland, and Scotland, the standard execution was to tie the witch to a wooden stake and set them ablaze. Sometimes a merciful executioner would strangle or behead the victim before the flames were lit, to spare them the pain of burning. But many were burned quick, alive, suffering a death of unspeakable agony. The process was a public spectacle. The condemned person, often already weakened by torture, would be led to a pyre piled with wood. The sentencing court or clergy would declare that the witch be consumed by fire so that their evil could be purged. When the torches ignited the brushwood, the unlucky victim was engulfed in flames before the eyes of assembled townsfolk. Historical records from Central Europe detail hundreds of such executions during intense witch panics. For example, at Würzburg and Bamberg in Germany, mass burnings occurred. In Bamberg alone, around 900 alleged witches were burned in a few years. Scotland too saw an enormous number of burnings. Roughly 4,000 people were burned as witches there, an astonishing figure for a small country. Being burned alive is one of the most painful deaths imaginable. Skin charring, lungs seared by hot air, nerve endings on fire. Victims might emit blood-curdling screams until the smoke and flames stole their voice. On some occasions, bags of gunpowder were tied to the condemned to hasten death by explosion. In other cases, they writhed until the ropes gave way and they fell, half dead, into the coals. Crowds treated these executions as both morbid entertainment and moral lesson. The rationale was that fire would purify the soul and prevent any remnant of the witch from continuing to harm the living. But in truth, burning at the stake served as a terrifying warning to the public, a visual representation of hell on earth. It ingrained fear in the populace and demonstrated the lengths to which authorities would go to eradicate the alleged servants of Satan. Allied POWs in Japanese camps during World War II faced a brutal reality few survived to tell. Starvation, disease, violent beatings, and relentless forced labor were a daily nightmare under captors who saw surrender as disgrace and treated prisoners without mercy. Japanese POW camps were arguably the worst of all, with more deaths occurring in these camps than in any others during the war. For many Allied soldiers, the nightmare began with mass surrenders after devastating defeats. In February 1942, the fall of Singapore, dubbed Britain's worst military disaster, saw about 80,000 British, Indian and Australian troops lay down their arms. They joined tens of thousands of other captives from earlier campaigns, suddenly at the mercy of an enemy that viewed them with contempt. Similarly, in the Philippines that same year, American and Filipino forces on the Bataan Peninsula, exhausted and out of supplies, were overwhelmed and compelled to surrender. The Bataan death march that followed has become infamous for its brutality. Some 75,000 POWs were forced to march roughly 65 miles under a blazing tropical sun with virtually no food or water. Stragglers who collapsed from exhaustion or thirst were beaten, bayoneted or shot by the Japanese escorts. Civilians who tried to pass water to the prisoners did so at risk of their lives. By the time the march ended at Camp O'Donnell, thousands had perished along the route. After capture, the ordeal continued with hellish transport to prison camps across the Japanese Empire. The Japanese crammed prisoners into suffocating rail boxcars or the holds of cargo ships infamously known as hell ships. On these voyages, men were packed so tightly they could hardly sit or breathe in the sweltering heat. One account describes 1,600 POWs shoved into a space meant for 500 on a prison ship. With hatches sealed and ventilation cut off to silence the prisoners' anguished cries, the air turned to poison. Trapped in darkness, men collapsed from heat and thirst. Disease spread rapidly in the filth, and Allied submarines or bombers, unaware these unmarked ships carried POWs, sometimes attacked them, killing many of the very men they sought to liberate. For those who lived through these journeys, arrival at a camp merely marked the start of a new chapter of suffering. Life inside a Japanese POW camp was a daily descent into degradation. Prisoners were typically given only a handful of rice and maybe a few vegetable scraps to eat, far too little to sustain a grown man. This starvation diet, often less than 700 calories per day, left men steadily wasting away. POWs grew gaunt and hollow-eyed. Ribs and bones protruded from bodies tormented by hunger. The Japanese guards deliberately withheld Red Cross food parcels meant for the prisoners, so the men had to scrounge for sustenance by bartering among themselves or eating whatever insects, weeds, or scraps they could find. Severe malnutrition soon set in, causing illnesses like beriberi due to vitamin deficiency that swelled their limbs and weakened their hearts. Camps were usually overcrowded and filthy. Dozens or even hundreds of captives were jammed into bamboo barracks or makeshift shelters with little sanitation. Clean water was scarce, and latrine facilities were primitive, leading to contamination and relentless disease. Tropical illnesses thrived in these conditions. Malaria-bearing mosquitoes, dengue fever, cholera, dysentery, skin ulcers, and fungal infections plagued the prisoners. Without proper medical supplies, even minor wounds or maladies could turn fatal. Japanese camp authorities offered minimal medical care. Often sick men lay in misery on bare bunks, with only the improvised care of fellow POWs or captured Allied medics to rely on. Each day followed a cruel routine. At dawn, weak and feverish men were driven out for morning roll call, where they stood for long periods at attention, sometimes in punishing heat or torrential rain, while guards counted and often recounted them. Afterward, they were dispatched to work details, if they were not already assigned to distant labor camps. The prisoners' physical state deteriorated rapidly under these hardships. One survivor noted that within months, we were all skin and bones, weighing around 100 pounds, down from a healthy weight well above that. The psychological strain of such an existence was immense. Cut off from the outside world, unsure if they would ever see home again, POWs battled despair as much as disease. Under constant watch, they had little freedom of movement or privacy. Writing diaries or keeping personal mementos was forbidden. Violations could invite severe punishment. Despite this, some prisoners secretly chronicled their ordeal or drew sketches, hiding these records at great risk. To combat the monotony and terror, POWs clung to routines or small rituals, quietly observing banned religious services, teaching each other languages, or fantasizing about food and family. Life in the camp was brutal, but the forced labor was even worse. The Japanese exploited Allied POWs for massive construction projects across occupied territories, the most infamous being the Burma-Thailand Death Railway. Starting in 1942, over 60,000 British, Australian, Dutch, and American prisoners were driven into jungles to carve a 415-kilometer railroad through mountains and swamps using only picks, shovels, and bare hands. Under relentless heat and monsoon rains, men in rags battled leeches, disease, and exhaustion while guards beat them to work faster. By completion, 16,000 POWs had died, with over 100,000 conscripted Asian laborers also perishing. Beyond the death railway, POWs were forced to build roads, bridges, and airstrips under brutal conditions. On Palawan, prisoners felled trees and hauled coral rock in the tropical sun, beaten if they slowed down. You either worked very hard or you were beaten unto death if necessary, one survivor recalled. Others were shipped throughout Japan, Korea, and Manchuria to labor in factories, mines, and shipyards, despite international laws forbidding POWs from war production. In Japan's mines, men worked in collapsing tunnels filled with toxic fumes, their bodies rotting from constant wet conditions. Weak and malnourished, they were still expected to meet harsh quotas under the threat of fatal beatings. Many worked until they simply collapsed. Japanese guards ruled the camps with iron discipline and fear, seeing POWs as disgraceful for surrendering. Even small infractions, like failing to bow, could lead to immediate beatings with bamboo canes, belts, or rifle butts, so routine that prisoners came to expect them. Beatings were common for stealing food or working too slowly, with guards and the feared Kempitai military police using cruel methods like tying men to trees for whipping or forcing them to stand in painful positions for hours. Some punishments were horrific. One Australian POW lost both legs after being forced to kneel on sharp bamboo until infection set in, while others were thrown into tiny, airless cells with no food or water for days, often leading to madness or permanent injury. The Japanese used collective punishment to instill fear, sometimes executing entire groups if one man escaped. American POW Henry Wilato recalled how escape attempts led to 9 innocent men being beheaded in retaliation, which led to prisoners policing each other through fear of punishment. Even sickness offered no reprieve. Guards dragged feverish, barely conscious men from infirmaries to meet work quotas, forcing comrades to carry them through the day until many died where they stood. The unpredictable cruelty of guards left prisoners in constant fear, never knowing which minor slip could trigger a brutal punishment. In August 1945, Japan's surrender brought the torment of POWs to an end. Guards fled or changed behavior overnight as Allied forces reached the camps, finding emaciated, disease-ridden men barely alive. Nearly 1 in 4 Allied POWs in Japanese hands had died by war's end, and many survivors were too weak to walk, carried out as skeletal figures who had somehow endured. Liberation began a long road to recovery. Some prisoners died, even after rescue, their bodies too damaged by starvation. Others faced months of treatment for disease and malnutrition, returning home as unrecognizable shadows of the men who had left for war. Many struggled with nightmares and flashbacks, while others remained silent, unable to share the horrors they had endured. After the war, Allied tribunals tried and executed some Japanese officers and camp guards for POW abuse, but many perpetrators were never prosecuted. For survivors, no punishment could erase their suffering. Their stories often went unheard for decades, overshadowed by other wartime horrors, until historians and memorials finally began to honor their sacrifice and resilience. Far from the romantic image of fearless explorers and warriors, the Viking Age had a dark underbelly built on human subjugation. Thralls labored in obscurity and misery, forming the foundation of Viking wealth and expansion. Stripped of rights and hope, they endured brutality beyond imagination. Slavery in Scandinavia wasn't new when the Vikings rose to power. It had existed for centuries. By the 8th century AD, a significant population of unfree people already lived in the north, many born into servitude over generations. What changed in the Viking Age was scale. The Norse made slave raiding a cornerstone of their economy and culture. Viking longships setting sail for foreign shores often had a purpose beyond mere plunder: to capture human cargo. Coastal villages from the British Isles to the Baltics learned to dread the dragon-proud ships, knowing that a raid could mean entire communities carried off into captivity. War captives were a primary source of slaves, but not the only one. In Norse lands, even locals could fall into slavery as punishment for crimes or due to crushing debts. Old Scandinavian laws prescribed that a convicted thief might be punished by reducing them to a slave of their victim. Desperate families sometimes sold children to pay for food during famine, condemning them to thraldom. In short, a Viking thrall could be made in many terrible ways: captured by force, condemned by law, sold or born into bondage if one's parents were already thralls. The ranks of Viking thralls were as diverse as the regions ravaged by Norse raids. War captives filled the slave markets: Anglo-Saxon villagers, Irish monks, Frankish peasants, and especially Slavic people from Eastern Europe. In fact, the very word slave stems from the Slavs who were frequently taken. In 821 AD, for example, the Annals of Ulster recorded a Viking raid near Dublin, where they carried off a great number of women into captivity. Women were often targeted. Viking raiders prized them not only for heavy work, but also for forced marriage or otherwise. Men taken as thralls might be strong farmers or defeated warriors, kept alive only to become beasts of burden. Children of thralls formed another segment. If born to enslaved parents, a child inherited their parents' status at birth. Some thralls had once been free Norsemen, debtors or criminals who lost their freedom as punishment. Regardless of origin, all thralls shared the same fate of being classed as human chattel at the bottom of society. Viking laws even reflected this dehumanization. In Old Norse, male and female slaves were often referred to in the neuter gender, essentially it, rather than as persons. They were considered property, no more entitled to rights than a horse or a hammer. The daily existence of a thrall was one of ceaseless drudgery. From the moment the pale Nordic sun rose, thralls were driven to work on whatever their masters demanded. On farms, agricultural labor was a common fate, plowing fields, tending livestock, and harvesting crops. The brief summers of the north were filled with back-breaking toil in the fields, and winters brought tedious chores like grinding grain or caring for animals in the biting cold. In the household, thralls handled the majority of menial tasks. They cooked meals over smoky hearths, hauled water and firewood, cleaned the longhouse, and even nursed or minded the master's children. Construction and craft duties could also fall to thralls. They were the muscle behind building projects, raising the timber halls and fences of a farm, digging ditches, or even helping construct the famous longships. Historians suggest that the enormous fleets of ships the Vikings built in the 9th century would have required a vast labor force, possibly thrall labor to fell trees and weave the massive wool sails. On the docks, thralls often did the heavy lifting, carrying cargo, caulking hulls, and maintaining ships for their owners' next voyage. In some cases, thralls with special skills were exploited for those talents. A captured blacksmith or woodworker might be forced to craft weapons, jewelry, or boats. Female thralls often toiled at textile production, spinning wool and weaving cloth. No thrall was spared. From the youngest able-bodied child to the eldest who could still lift a tool. Children might start with simple chores, but they quickly learned that idleness led to harsh punishment. The elderly or infirm thralls, if any survived to old age, were often considered burdens. Masters had little incentive to care for a slave who could no longer work. For all thralls, leisure was almost non-existent. One saga recounts that a benevolent master gave his slaves a small portion of free time in the evenings to tend their own small plots, but such kindness was extraordinarily rare. In most cases, a thrall's day ended only when sheer exhaustion or darkness forced a halt to labor, and the night brought only a few hours of sleep before the grind began again. Life as a thrall was cruel not just because of the work, but because of the conditions and treatment imposed by their owners. Thralls lived at the whims of their masters, and that could range from neglectful to outright sadistic. Most were given only meager provisions, coarse bread or porridge, perhaps fish or scraps from the family's table, just enough to keep them alive for the next day's work. Their clothing was rough and often ragged. A thrall might wear the same wool tunic until it fell to pieces. Housing for thralls was similarly miserable. On smaller farmsteads, slaves typically slept on the floor in the darkest end of the longhouse, alongside goats and cows in the byre. They bedded down in straw, breathing smoke and animal stink, with no privacy or comfort. Larger estates might have had barracks or shacks for slaves. Archaeologists have found sites in Scandinavia, like the Swedish site of Sander, where clusters of tiny huts around a great hall could have been slave quarters. Discipline was brutal. If a thrall disobeyed or faltered, they could expect a beating. Owners had legal rights to punish slaves as much as they saw fit. A slave who did not behave properly would be whipped or beaten with rods, and there was often no limit to a master's wrath. Some slaves were kept in chains or iron collars, especially when being transported or if they were prone to running away. Iron shackles dating to the Viking Age have been found in ports like Birka, Sweden, and Dublin Island. The psychological torment was immense. A thrall lived in constant fear, knowing a minor mistake or mere bad temper of the owner could bring pain or even death. Families formed by slaves were fragile and often cruelly torn apart. A master could decide to sell off a thrall's children or spouse at any time, shattering whatever semblance of family life a slave had managed to build. Even the death of a master offered no release for some. Vikings sometimes killed slaves to bury them with their masters, a final sacrifice to serve the Lord in the afterlife. Archaeologists in Scandinavia have uncovered slave remains in high-status graves, often showing signs of violent death like decapitation, indicating these thralls were butchered as offerings to accompany dead chieftains or to appease the gods. Paradoxically, thralls were both a product of Viking warfare and a tool that enabled it. Raiding and enslavement went hand in hand. One of the objectives of Viking raids was specifically to capture slaves for profit. Viking expansion across Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries can't be separated from slavery. The prospect of lucrative human loot drove many Viking incursions. Bands of Norse raiders would descend on a coastal village or monastery, kill those who resisted, and shackle the rest to be dragged to the ships. These captives swelled the thrall population back home and filled the slave markets abroad. Human beings became just another form of treasure. On Viking ships, free warriors were the ones who roared into battle, but thralls were likely used as rowing muscle during long voyages or when manpower was short. A thrall might be ordered to pull an oar on the longship, though they would not share in the glory or spoils of the raid. In camps or on the move, thralls served as porters and camp servants, cooking meals for the warband, setting up tents, caring for horses, and carrying heavy loads of loot back to the ships. Their presence allowed the Viking fighting men to conserve strength for combat. Some thralls might even have been forced to take up arms in dire situations, but generally Vikings did not trust slaves with weapons unless absolutely necessary. As Vikings settled new territories, from the Danelaw in England to colonies in Iceland and beyond, thralls were brought along to do the back-breaking work of colonization. Early Icelandic accounts note that many settlers brought Irish or British thralls to populate their homesteads, putting them to work in clearing land and tending farms in the harsh new environment. Genetic studies even suggest a large number of women in Iceland were of Gaelic origin, likely taken there as thralls or concubines. Thralls helped Vikings establish control after a raid as quickly as possible. Enslaving locals meant the conquerors instantly had a labor force to till fields and support the Viking overlords. Slaves taken in raids were a highly profitable commodity in the Viking Age. Viking traders sold thralls across a vast network, turning human misery into wealth. Markets sprang up in major trading towns: Hedeby in Denmark, Birka in Sweden, Dublin in Ireland, where thralls were bought and sold like cattle. Norse merchants brought slaves to foreign markets as well. Arab chroniclers of the 10th century wrote of Viking slave traders carrying human cargo as far as the Mediterranean. One account by Ibn Hawqal in 977 AD describes Vikings selling slaves in markets from Spain to North Africa and Egypt. Along the Volga trade routes, Vikings exchanged Slavic captives for silver, silk, and spices from the Islamic world. Over time, this trade became so extensive that medieval observers described it as the main business of Scandinavian explorers in the East. For most Viking thralls, hope of freedom was a faint and distant light. The vast majority lived and died in bondage. However, Viking society did allow for manumission, the freeing of slaves, under certain conditions. A master might free a thrall as a reward for years of loyal service or exceptional deeds. In a few cases, thralls were permitted to buy their own freedom. This was an almost insurmountable task, since thralls earned little to nothing of their own. But if a slave somehow amassed wealth, perhaps by tipping fees, gifts, or by working extra hours on tasks allowed by the master, they could offer to purchase their liberty. Freedom brought improved status, but it was not full equality. Former thralls remained socially inferior to the freeborn. They often continued working for their old masters as tenant farmers or labourers, just with a modicum of autonomy. In some cases, freed thralls had to pay an ongoing duty or loyalty to their ex-master, or were required by law to leave the district to prevent a mass of rootless freedmen causing unrest. Adjusting to freedom could be psychologically challenging. A lifetime of enslavement did not prepare one for independent life. Yet, despite the obstacles, the possibility of manumission was a vital ember of hope. It meant that not all thralls died as thralls, and that a lucky or determined few could live out their last days under the sky as free men and women. Over the 11th and 12th centuries, the institution of slavery in the Norse world slowly waned. The spread of Christianity played a significant role in this decline, as Christian ethics frowned on enslaving fellow Christians. Scandinavia's conversion led to growing pressure to end the practice, though it didn't disappear overnight. By the late 1200s, laws in the north still made reference to slaves, but outright slavery was fading into serfdom and other forms of unfree labor. In some Viking-founded kingdoms abroad, laws were passed to cripple the slave trade. For instance, England banned the export of Christian slaves in 1102, which dealt a severe blow to markets like Dublin. Over time, economic changes and outside influence turned slave-taking from an accepted norm into a mark of backwardness. By the High Middle Ages, the era of the Viking thrall had come to an end, though not before countless lives had been ground down in misery. The tale of the Viking thrall is a stark reminder that the glories of the Viking Age were built on a foundation of human suffering. For every Viking berserker celebrating in a mead hall, dozens of thralls labored unseen in the shadows, paying for that society with their sweat, tears, and blood. In the dim gaslight of Victorian London's foggy alleys, two women draped in tattered shawls prowl the street, searching for their next clients. They are some of the thousands of streetwalkers eking out a living in the city's underbelly, women whom polite society called fallen and condemned as a great social evil. By mid-Victorian times, the shadow of prostitution lay across every slum and street corner of London. Police registers documented only 5,000 to 8,000 women arrested for solicitation or brothel keeping, yet sensational press reports inflated numbers to as many as 50,000 to 80,000 unfortunates. In this era, any unwed woman engaging in sex outside marriage risked the stigma of fallen, a label far broader than streetwalking alone. Most were driven by dire economic need, so-called respectable work in factories, laundry houses, or domestic service paid starvation wages. When paydays failed to cover rent, food, or the care of children, many saw no other means of survival but to sell sexual favors. A tiny minority worked as high-class courtesans, earning enough from elite clients to retire, but the vast majority were seamstresses, servants, or rural migrants compelled into the streets by unemployment, eviction, or pregnancy. These prostitutes were overwhelmingly young working-class women, often former servants dismissed or cast out after a seduction left them pregnant. Others drifted gradually into streetwalking, keeping their day jobs while taking occasional nighttime clients to make ends meet. Their brief flirtation with amateur prostitution sometimes allowed them to slip back into respectable life when circumstances improved. Such women often did not consider themselves irredeemably fallen, and indeed many hoped to save enough money to leave the life. Many, however, were unable to return to polite society and descended into full-time prostitution. Nightfall in Victorian London's poorer districts brought the unfortunates out to ply their trade under the gas lamps. A streetwalker's daily life was a cycle of uncertainty and danger. She might begin her evening wandering a known red light area, perhaps the Strand, Haymarket, Whitechapel, or around train stations like Waterloo, where Granby Street was notorious for its women half-naked beckoning from windows. Clad in cheap finery or well-worn dresses, these women braved the elements year-round. They spent long hours trudging through rain and cold, loitering on corners and outside pubs to catch the eye of potential clients. Many were homeless or lived day-to-day in lodging houses, so earning a few coins by midnight was critical just to pay for a bed and a meager meal. It was not uncommon to hear a shivering prostitute beg a passerby for the price of a night's lodging. If luck was against her and she found no clients, she might sleep rough in the alleys or sell what few belongings she had to avoid that fate. Clients, ranging from sailors to slumming gentlemen, often turned violent, robbing or assaulting women who had no legal standing and feared that any complaint might land them in prison for soliciting. The most horrific example of violence came in 1888, when an unknown predator, infamously dubbed Jack the Ripper, stalked Whitechapel's impoverished prostitutes. In the span of a few months, 5 street women were not only murdered but gruesomely mutilated late at night. The threat of disease also loomed large. Venereal illnesses like syphilis and gonorrhea were endemic. Untreated syphilis could disfigure, deafen, blind, or drive a woman insane, while gonorrhea brought chronic pain and infertility. Lock hospitals offered forced confinement for treatment, but the cure was often as humiliating as the disease. Not all Victorian prostitutes roamed the streets. Many worked in brothels which ranged from lavishly furnished townhouses to filthy cribs in slums. A brothel worker might enjoy a roof over her head and some protection from street violence, but her life was hardly easier. In upscale establishments, known euphemistically as disorderly houses or gentlemen's clubs, women served wealthy clients by appointment. These high-end madames enforced strict rules. Girls had to be young and attractive, dress elegantly. Often the madame would front the cost of gowns and cosmetics, and be available on demand. The surroundings were comfortable and the pay could be better, but the work was relentless and appearances had to be kept up at all times. A brothel girl in the West End might see several clients in a day, from evening until the early hours, then collapse into bed only to start again the next night. She also typically owed a hefty portion of her earnings to the house. Exploitation was common. Madames would charge exorbitant fees for board and clothing, keeping the women perpetually in debt and unable to leave. In lower-class brothels, perhaps a few rented rooms in a rookery. Conditions were downright dire. Several women might share a single tiny room to entertain customers in succession. Privacy, sanitation, and safety were minimal. If a client turned violent, there was little recourse except the hope that other girls or a bouncer might intervene. Brothels themselves were targets of both criminals and the law. Pimps and bullies loitered around these houses, often protecting the premises in exchange for a cut of profits, or sometimes just extorting money with threats. Police periodically raided brothels, not necessarily to rescue the women, but to appease public complaints about vice. The women caught in raids were usually released with a fine or a warning, unless they were charged with solicitation, but a brothel keeper could face prison. This instability meant brothel workers might find themselves out on the street if a house suddenly closed. The grim existence of a prostitute in Victorian London was a life of survival against the odds, played out in shadowy alleys and cramped garrets under the constant spectre of hunger, infection, and abuse. These women lived at society's margins, shunned, exploited, and largely unheard, except when they became a problem to be policed or a soul to be saved. And yet, their presence forced Victorian society to confront its own contradictions. The wealth and poverty side by side, the rigid morals that demanded female purity while tolerating male vice, the philanthropy that aspired to rescue the fallen even as economic structures pushed so many over the brink. Beneath the bustling streets and grand castles of Tudor England, a silent workforce laboured in darkness, battling filth to protect society from drowning in its own waste. Among historical professions, the gong farmer stands out as possibly the most disgusting and horrifying job on record. In medieval Europe, managing human waste became an urgent problem as towns grew. Early on, many simply dumped chamber pots into the street or river, leaving the rain to wash the filth away. The resulting stench and disease, exemplified by recurring plagues, gradually taught authorities that filth bred disease. By Tudor England, 1485 to 1603, efforts were made to curb the mess. Cities built public latrines, and homeowners constructed private privies over cesspits. These cesspits would slowly fill over a year or two, until the waste threatened to overflow and contaminate streets and wells. It was only a matter of time before someone had to shovel out the foul contents. And thus emerged the gong farmer. The word gong came from the Old English gang, meaning to go, a slang word for both a privy and its contents. By trade, these men, sometimes called nightmen, dug out and carried off human excrement from privies and cesspits. Because their work was so malodorous and disturbing to the public, laws forbade them from working in daylight. A regulation from 1562 reads, "No gongfermor shall carry any ordure till after 9 of the clock in the night." As a result, all their labour took place under cover of darkness, roughly 9 p.m. to 5 a.m., when townsfolk were indoors and the streets were quiet. By the late 15th century, gong farmers were an established, if begrudged, part of urban life, even charging standard rates like 2 shillings per ton of waste removed, a testament to how vital and sizable the task of waste removal had become in an age before plumbing. Who would take on such a nauseating job? Gong farmers were often society's most desperate or pragmatic individuals, attracted by surprisingly decent pay. Records from Tudor England indicate they could earn around 6pence a day, equivalent to a week's wages for ordinary labourers, making the job financially tempting despite its repulsiveness. At Hampton Court, Queen Elizabeth I's palace, gong farmers were similarly compensated, reflecting the essential nature of their work. Yet volunteers remained scarce, deterred by the severe social stigma and horrific working conditions. Many gong farmers were born into the role or resorted to it after other doors closed. On a typical night, a gong farmer's routine was a horrific mix of drudgery, danger, and disgust. Under cover of darkness, gong farmers set out with spades, buckets, and lanterns, navigating alleys to reach privies behind houses or castles. Some workers would announce their presence, signaling the end of privy use until cleaning finished. Typically working in teams of 3 to 4, one man would descend into the cesspit, shoveling the thick sludge into buckets. The air was thick, warm, and chokingly foul with ammonia and decay. Workers coped by smoking tobacco or tying vinegar-soaked cloths over their noses. The stench was so intense that even Queen Elizabeth I reportedly left Hampton Court Palace during cesspit cleanings. The pits were deadly traps, filled with toxic gases like methane and hydrogen sulfide. Above ground, teammates hauled up the heavy buckets by rope and transferred them onto carts. Occasionally, young boys were employed to maneuver into smaller spaces inaccessible to adults, turning gong farming into a grim family trade. A rare bonus was finding valuables, coins or jewelry inadvertently dropped into privies that gong farmers were allowed to keep. Waste was hauled beyond city limits, either discarded or sold to farmers as fertilizer. At dawn, exhausted gong farmers returned to isolated homes, attempting to wash off a stench that never fully disappeared. By evening, the cycle began anew, a ceaseless, grim battle waged in darkness so others could wake to cleaner streets. Though gong farmers earned decent wages, their health and nutrition often suffered greatly due to the horrific conditions of their work. With earnings sufficient for quality bread, meat, and ale, money alone couldn't shield them from the constant filth. The overwhelming stench of human waste frequently dampened their appetites and isolated them socially, making it hard to eat comfortably in public. Most were shunned from inns or markets, forced instead to eat alone or among fellow gong farmers. To cope with exhausting nights, gong farmers commonly turned to strong drinks like brandy and ale. One royal account notes a gong farmer employed by Queen Elizabeth was even partially paid in brandy, intended to numb the senses against the job's foulness. Heavy drinking, of course, brought its own health risks, including dehydration and liver damage, while doing nothing to prevent illness. Constant exposure to sewage placed gong farmers at serious risk of disease. Dysentery, skin infections from cuts contacting contaminated waste, and chronic respiratory problems caused by toxic gases and ammonia inhalation were commonplace. Some gong farmers collapsed from sewer gas inhalation. Even if they avoided immediate catastrophe, years of exposure often resulted in severe chronic conditions and lasting physical damage. During World War II, the Atlantic Ocean hid a deadly threat beneath its waves: German U-boats. Feared by Allied navies, these submarines were also a kind of prison for the men who served on them. Cramped, suffocating, and constantly hunted, life aboard a U-boat was a relentless struggle for survival. The origins of German submarine warfare stretch back to World War I, when Germany first recognized the immense strategic value of stealth attacks beneath the waves. Despite their initial effectiveness, U-boats in the First World War had limitations that restricted their operational reach and duration. Recognizing these shortcomings, German naval planners invested heavily in interwar advancements. Significant technological improvements were made in hull designs, propulsion systems, and armaments, culminating in the devastatingly effective U-boat fleet of World War II. Central to these developments was the Type 7C, the principal submarine class of the Kriegsmarine. Specifically engineered for the grueling conditions of the North Atlantic, these vessels were tasked with intercepting and devastating Allied convoys far beyond the protective cover of friendly aircraft. Despite their formidable capabilities, the U-boats were notoriously uncomfortable and unsafe. The focus was purely on combat effectiveness, with minimal consideration for crew comfort or safety. As a result, submariners were forced to live among machinery, armaments, and supplies in spaces designed with little regard for human endurance. Each crew member aboard a U-boat had specialized roles, often performing multiple critical tasks necessary for survival and operational effectiveness. Commanding officers bore immense responsibility, making crucial decisions during combat engagements, directing attacks, and maneuvering their boats to evade detection. Navigators, often doubling as quartermasters, meticulously managed scarce provisions, charted routes through hazardous waters, and kept detailed logs essential for navigation. Engineers played an indispensable role, maintaining and repairing diesel engines essential for surface propulsion and electric battery systems critical for underwater stealth operations. Their constant vigilance ensured that the submarine remained operational even under the most punishing conditions. Torpedo specialists, tasked with the preparation and maintenance of the vessel's deadly payload, spent much of their time near the weapons storage compartments, ever ready to engage enemy targets. Radio men maintained vital communications with German high command and coordinated fleet activities, transmitting and receiving messages that could alter the course of their mission in an instant. Sonar operators remained tirelessly vigilant, monitoring oceanic sounds to detect approaching enemy vessels and aircraft, crucially aiding in defensive and offensive maneuvers. Even the cook's role was essential. Operating within the tiny galley, the cook was tasked not only with preparing meals, but also lifting crew morale, providing much-needed respite and brief moments of comfort amidst the constant strain. Daily life aboard a U-boat was brutally punishing, defined by severe physical hardship and mental strain. Around 50 men inhabited spaces barely sufficient for half that number, every available nook occupied by piping, wiring, equipment, and essential provisions. Privacy was non-existent, with sleeping quarters reduced to cramped bunks stacked along narrow corridors. Crewmen were routinely disturbed, their sleep interrupted by passing colleagues or sudden alarms signaling imminent danger. Hygiene deteriorated rapidly aboard U-boats, as freshwater reserves were strictly rationed for drinking purposes. Showers were a luxury the crew could not afford. Submariners were constantly damp, suffering from persistent moisture that exacerbated skin conditions, fungal infections, and overall discomfort. Stagnant air compounded the misery, laden with a revolting mixture of sweat, oil, diesel fumes, and human waste. Seasickness was a relentless torment, particularly in heavy seas, aggravating the already unbearable discomfort. Crewmen assigned to deck watch endured freezing temperatures, relentless winds, and the constant threat of enemy aircraft detection. Returning from duty soaking wet provided no relief, as uniforms seldom dried fully before the next shift. This perpetually damp environment not only increased discomfort, but significantly heightened the risk of respiratory infections and general ill health, further weakening the crew's capacity to perform their duties effectively. Despite horrific conditions, the German Navy understood the importance of nutrition in maintaining crew morale and physical capability. U-boats initially stocked fresh produce, meats, and vegetables quickly consumed due to limited refrigeration capacity. After these initial supplies depleted, meals rapidly devolved into repetitive, unappetizing fare, consisting primarily of canned soups, preserved meats, potatoes, bread, and biscuits. Chocolate and other rare treats occasionally provided a minor morale boost. Prolonged patrols required risky mid-sea resupply operations, dangerously exposing crews to detection and attacks by enemy forces. These monotonous and insufficient diets weakened the submariners' immune systems, leaving them highly vulnerable to infections and chronic illnesses. Medical care aboard was primitive at best, with serious injuries or illnesses frequently resulting in prolonged suffering or death, as evacuation for treatment was often impossible. The psychological pressure faced by U-boat crews was relentless and severe. Long patrols, often lasting weeks or months, imposed brutal isolation and confinement, exacerbating feelings of anxiety and depression. The constant fear of discovery and the relentless threat of depth charge attacks made psychological strain often unbearable. The sound of enemy sonar pings or the distant rumble of approaching destroyers induced terror, creating an environment of constant oppressive tension. Morale further deteriorated as reports of devastating Allied air raids on German cities reached submariners, who worried endlessly about their loved ones back home. In an attempt to counteract the mental strain, commanders introduced recreational activities such as reading, chess, and card games, along with ideological propaganda sessions designed to reinforce commitment and camaraderie. Nonetheless, the mental burdens endured by these men often proved overwhelming, manifesting as severe anxiety, depression, paranoia, and debilitating fear. The harsh reality of serving aboard a U-boat is reflected starkly in sobering statistics. During World War II, U-boat submariners faced the highest casualty rate of any German forces, with a devastating 70% fatality rate. A further 711 of the 1,149 deployed U-boats were lost, a 61% destruction rate. The average life expectancy for a U-boat sailor was a mere 60 days, underscoring the extraordinary dangers endured by these men in the unforgiving depths of the ocean. For centuries, the world's great warships ruled the waves with thundering cannons and billowing sails, but hidden behind the booming broadsides were children at war. Few roles in the Age of Sail were as perilous or tragic as that of the powder monkey, the boys tasked with ferrying gunpowder from the ship's magazine to its guns. Ranging from 8 to 14 years old, these youths scurried through smoke-choked decks, carrying sacks of explosive powder while shot and splinters whirled around them. The practice of using boys as powder carriers emerged with the rise of large naval artillery in the Age of Sail, roughly the 17th through 19th centuries. The British Royal Navy first coined the term powder monkey in the 17th century, and by the 18th century, virtually every fighting ship, British, French, American or otherwise, had its complement of these child runners. They used quick, agile boys to sprint between the magazine and gun crews in spaces too cramped for grown men. Their speed became a tactical edge. Without them, a ship's rate of fire collapsed. During the great wars of the late 1700s and early 1800s, Napoleonic, 1812 and beyond, powder monkeys were as vital as gunners, though they held no rank and often went unlisted on the rolls. Most recruits came from society's ragged edge, street orphans, workhouse inmates, or sons of destitute dock workers who traded hunger ashore for rations at sea. Jonas Hanway's Marine Society in London alone clothed and shipped hundreds of impoverished youths each year, presenting the arrangement as charity while funneling fresh labour to the fleet. Voluntary enlistment wasn't the only pipeline. Royal Navy press gangs dragged boys from quayside taverns or merchant brigs whenever manpower ran low. Once their papers were signed or forged, escape became nearly impossible. Across the Atlantic, the early US Navy listed boy third class at the absolute bottom of the pay table, about $6 a month, roughly $170 in modern money, while French mousses and Spanish grumetes earned even less. Rankless and voiceless, they inhabited a legal limbo that exposed them to corporal punishment and withheld any share of prize money. Life aboard a man-of-war was punishing even for adults. For a powder monkey, it was non-stop labour and danger. Outside battle, the boys doubled as cabin servants and deckhands, rising before dawn to scrub planks with sand and holy stones, haul water, launder clothes, scour galley pots, polish guns, lug rope, tend chickens or goats, mend sails, and run messages. Leisure did not exist. They were the ship's default errand runners. Meanwhile, they were being groomed as future seamen. Veteran hands hauled them aloft to learn the ropes, scrambling up swaying masts to reef sails high above the sea. Officers claimed early exposure built the agility and nerve needed in storms. When not overhead, they scurried through press-packed decks. First-rate ships crammed 800 souls into a floating city. Children slept wherever space remained. Hammocks slung below the guns or deep in the orlop beside the powder magazine, air thick with bilge, smoke, and sweat, alive with rats and insects. Filth and confinement quickly became normal. Treatment varied. Many sailors treated the boys like mascots, slipping them extra food or shielding them from harm. Others vented frustrations on the smallest bodies. Bullying, beatings, and even abuse occurred, and naval discipline offered no mercy. A boy who erred was bent over a cannon and caned, up to a dozen strokes, enough to welt him for weeks. The constant threat of punishment layered atop an unforgiving hierarchy that demanded instant obedience to every rank, kept them in chronic exhaustion. Muscles sore from toil, nerves taut, eyes forever scanning for the next shouted order. Thus, the powder monkey's routine was an endless circuit of chores, perilous training climbs, cramped sleep, and the looming reality of battle, endured by children the adults considered the lowest creatures aboard His Majesty's or any nation's ships of war. Powder monkey's meals mirrored the adult allowance: salt pork or beef, dried peas, oatmeal, and rock-hard hardtack biscuits alive with weevils. Boys quickly learned to wrap the bread on the table to knock insects free, or soak it in coffee to soften the crust. Fresh fruit or vegetables were rare and usually reserved for officers, so vitamin C deficiency rotted gums and loosened teeth until the Admiralty mandated daily lemon juice in the 1790s. Water kept in oak casks slimed within weeks. Men and boys alike drank sour beer or heavily watered rum, grog, because fermentation killed pathogens. Thus, 12-year-olds drew rum rations almost from the day they stepped aboard. Injuries were constant. A recoiling 32-pounder could crush ribs. A falling block could smash a skull. Splinters 3 feet long turned cannonballs into shotgun blasts. The ship's surgeon, armed with saws, forceps, and laudanum, worked on the orlop using a leather strap as a bite block. Amputation was common. Antiseptics were not, so infection killed more monkeys than enemy iron. The psychological toll on powder monkeys was crushing. Children who once roamed shore streets, impoverished but free, found themselves captives in a floating barracks ruled by iron discipline. Any illusions of adventure vanished with the first crack of the bosun's cane or sight of a broadside. Cut off from family, forced to swallow fear and grief, each boy occupied the very bottom of shipboard society and learned early that showing emotion invited more abuse. Battle magnified every terror. At all hands to quarters, the boys stuffed rags in their ears, plunged into the dim magazine for powder bags, and sprinted along smoke-choked passages while the hull shuddered and oak splinters scythed through flesh. Cannon blasts roared, men screamed, and friends fell in moments. Yet the monkeys had to keep running, for the ship's rate of fire, and often the outcome, depended on them. Many were maimed or killed mid-dash. Those who survived witnessed decapitations, flash fires, and decks awash in blood, all before their 14th birthday. When silence finally fell, shock continued. corpses lined for burial, amputated limbs tossed overboard, decks holystoned free of gore. Survivors' guilt and nightmares were inevitable, but 18th century navies offered no comfort or counseling. A boy who broke down risked scorn or punishment, so traumas were swallowed until they warped into hardened detachment or despair. Because voyages and wars stretched for years, escape was nearly impossible. Pressed lads had no hope of early release. Desertion in port meant the lash or the gallows, and some children jumped overboard in hopeless bids for freedom or otherwise. A handful won medals for valor under fire, but countless others simply endured, clinging to camaraderie with fellow boys or a rare kindly sailor. Even those brief ties were fragile. Death could claim a friend in the next engagement. Thus, powder monkeys bore some of the fleet's heaviest burdens with the fewest defenses. Their childhoods were erased by terror, grief, and relentless danger, leaving scars they carried long after they left the sea, if they lived that long at all. For centuries, the open seas were a place of trade, warfare, and exploration, but for some, they were a floating prison. Few fates were as brutal as that of the galley slave. Shackled to their oars, whipped into exhaustion, and forced to row until their bodies gave out. These men lived and died in a never-ending cycle of suffering. The practice of using human power to propel ships dates back to ancient civilizations, with the earliest records indicating that free citizens primarily manned the oars. In ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome, rowing was considered a skilled profession, and those who took on this role were often compensated for their labor. Slaves were occasionally employed during times of manpower shortages, but this was not the standard practice. As maritime warfare evolved, especially during the medieval and Renaissance periods, the demand for rowers increased significantly. Mediterranean powers such as Venice, Spain, and the Ottoman Empire expanded their naval fleets, leading to a higher demand for manpower. This surge in naval activity coincided with a shift towards the use of forced labor. Convicts, prisoners of war, and enslaved individuals were increasingly utilized to meet the growing need for rowers. Galley slaves came from diverse and often tragic backgrounds. Many were prisoners of war, captured during the numerous conflicts between Christian and Muslim states, and subsequently forced into servitude as rowers. Convicted criminals also found themselves sentenced to the galleys for offenses ranging from theft to rebellion. Political and religious dissenters, including heretics and other perceived enemies of the state, were condemned to this harsh existence as a means of punishment and control. Additionally, pirates and enemy forces frequently kidnapped impoverished civilians from coastal regions, selling them into slavery to serve on galleys. Some destitute individuals, driven by desperation, voluntarily joined the galleys in exchange for basic sustenance, unaware of the brutal conditions they would face. This mixture of backgrounds resulted in crews composed of various nationalities, religions, and languages, leading to communication challenges and internal conflicts among the enslaved rowers. Life aboard a galley was a relentless ordeal marked by grueling labor, harsh discipline, and deplorable living conditions. Galley slaves were shackled to their rowing benches, confining them to a narrow space where they spent almost the entirety of their existence. These benches served as their dining area, sleeping quarters, and even the place for bodily functions, as movement was severely restricted. The chains ensured that slaves remained in position, preventing any chance of escape or significant movement, rowing sessions were exhaustive, often lasting between 10 to 12 hours with minimal rest. During naval engagements or emergencies, slaves could be forced to row continuously through the night, pushing human endurance to its limits. The physical demands were immense, requiring synchronized effort to maneuver the massive oars that powered the vessel. Discipline on galleys was maintained through fear and brutal punishment. Overseers wielded whips, clubs, and heated irons to enforce obedience and maximize output. Any sign of fatigue, dissent, or failure to maintain the rowing rhythm could result in immediate and severe corporal punishment, serving as a grim reminder to others of the consequences of defiance. The confined quarters of the galley were plagued by unsanitary conditions, with slaves eating, sleeping, and relieving themselves in the same cramped space. The stench of sweat, excrement, and unwashed bodies was overpowering. Such an environment was a breeding ground for disease, exacerbated by the lack of proper hygiene facilities. Often exposed to the elements, galley slaves endured the full brunt of nature's extremes. Under the scorching sun, they faced dehydration and heat exhaustion, while cold nights brought chills and the risk of hypothermia. Violent storms added another layer of peril, with slaves remaining chained to their benches, unable to seek shelter or safety. In the event of capsize, this often resulted in galley slaves going down with their ship. The daily existence of galley slaves was marked by severe deprivation and neglect, particularly concerning their nutrition and health. Galley slaves subsisted on a meager and nutritionally deficient diet. Their daily fare typically included stale bread, thin gruel, or a basic stew, which often lacked essential nutrients. The quality of food was poor, with provisions sometimes spoiled or infested with vermin, further diminishing their nutritional value. This inadequate diet failed to meet the caloric demands of the grueling physical labor required of the rowers. Access to fresh water was also severely limited aboard galleys. Water rations were strictly controlled, and slaves often received insufficient quantities to stay hydrated, especially under the relentless heat of the sun. Dehydration was a common affliction, exacerbating the physical strain and leading to a host of health issues. The combination of poor diet and unsanitary living conditions created a breeding ground for diseases. Malnutrition weakened the immune systems of the slaves, making them susceptible to ailments such as scurvy, caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, and dysentery, resulting from contaminated food and water. Infections were rampant, and the close quarters facilitated the rapid spread of illnesses. The lack of fresh produce and balanced nutrition led to chronic health problems, further diminishing the slaves' ability to endure the harsh conditions. Medical care for galley slaves was also virtually non-existent. Injuries sustained from the strenuous rowing, frequent beatings, and accidents were rarely treated adequately. Open wounds often became infected, and without proper medical intervention, many injuries proved fatal. Diseases went largely untreated, and afflicted individuals were typically left to suffer without relief. The mortality rate was high, with many slaves dying at their benches still shackled in place. Their bodies were often disposed of unceremoniously, reflecting the disregard for their lives and well-being. The psychological torment endured by galley slaves was profound, stemming from the harsh realities of their existence. For many galley slaves, the prospect of regaining freedom was bleak. Sentences were often for life, and the grueling conditions made survival itself uncertain. This pervasive sense of hopelessness eroded their will, as the endless days of toil offered little respite or possibility of release. Faced with unbearable suffering, some slaves saw death as the only escape. Instances of individuals throwing themselves overboard were not uncommon, choosing the uncertainty of the sea over the certainty of continued torment. Others attempted rebellion or escape, despite the overwhelming odds and the severe repercussions if recaptured. These acts, though often futile, underscored the depth of their desperation and desire for autonomy. The psychological and physical hardships of galley slavery created an environment where despair was pervasive, and mortality was a constant companion.